Good morning, everyone. So there's lots of slides in here, loads of different stuff. So if you do have questions, just throw your hand up or shout the question out. My mum was a teacher. I have no education, so you're already doing better than me. I was kicked out of school after GCSEs because I wasn't academic enough. Apparently now that's quite a cool thing, but for my mum, who was a teacher, she wasn't very impressed. So important to note, you've got some amazing speakers on ethics and technology. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a technologist, and I'm also not a lawyer, although I'm still working out which of these I would be if I could be anywhere. And the thing with technology is it encompasses all of those three areas so much these days. It's not just about writing lines of code, it's about thinking about how it all comes together. So I started a business back in 2015 called People.io, and the idea of People.io was to create a unified API for all of your data. So imagine you could walk into a room and all of your data from across your life would come with you. And so the way we started that was we created an app, and the app was designed for 16 to 25-year-olds. And the idea behind the app was really simple. We wanted to find a way of getting people to care about their data. So if someone walks up to you in the street today and says, hey, do you want to use an app where it brings all your data together? You go, no. If they say it's on the blockchain, you probably tell them to go away even quicker. And if you say that it does really cool stuff, you're going to say, well, what's in it for me? What do I get out of it? So the idea of our app was you'd download it and you'd answer questions. They were really simple swipe card questions, but every time you answered a question, you got paid. So the idea was you understood by creating new data there was value. And then we asked you to connect external data into the app, and every time you did that, you got paid. And then we would introduce you to different brands, kind of like advertising really, but every time you saw an advert, you'd get paid. So the idea of the app was suddenly saying, instead of saying, oh hey, you should manage your data better, like it's better for your privacy and everything, we went the other way. We said, actually, if you manage your data, there's like a lot of value in doing that. We managed to launch it with Telefonica in Germany, we got loads of press, I got to ring the NASDAQ bell, advise the government, we managed to get to #1 spot in the App Store above Love Island, I was happy to see, but we were just below Tinder, which really upset me. So that was all great until it all went wrong. And the reason it went wrong is because it worked too well. We launched the app in 2017, we ended up with 100,000 users within the first 4 months. And our technology simply couldn't handle it. We had 2 developers at the time, and their heads were exploding. So then we pivoted, and we went back to the original plan, which was the API. So we did all of that, and then that went wrong because, again, we didn't have the right resource, and part of the startup world is that you fail at most things and you succeed at very few every now and again. So the story behind all of this, and where my head was at when I created all of this, was looking at this. So this is what they call the MarTech Lumascape. So it's about 6,000 companies that exist in the background, all of the different websites and apps that you use. And all of these companies are focused on some part of the advertising ecosystem. And their like holy grail really is to create this. It's called a unified view. And it's basically all the different data sources from across your life to create a single view of you. So they know what you've just bought, where you bought it, where you're going, who you're with, what you're likely to do next. And so that's why when you look at an advert or a product on Amazon and then you go to Facebook, that product follows you around the internet. It's all because of these companies that work in the background. So this is what advertisers do. And it's very similar to this. So this is where they're analyzing email addresses and login and user behavior to create the metadata, etc. The difference between the two of them is the first one is a product from the advertising industry where actually George Clooney will go to the conferences and sell it for them. The other one is the NSA. It was the PRISM revelations that came out from Edward Snowden a few years ago. What's scary about that is the amount of data being hoarded by the advertising industry and by other industries is greater than a lot of what was exposed from the PRISM revelations. And all that data comes from lots of different places, places you wouldn't necessarily expect. So this, I had to anonymize the website because I got told off once about showing their logo. But on the right-hand side, there's 84 different companies that track you when you're reading about Kardashians. And now with GDPR, which was meant to create better protection for people for consent, when you go in and you look at the, you go into the consent settings in here, it's gone from kind of 80 odd different companies to this huge list of companies. And when you press accept, you're giving permission to every single one of those companies to track you on that website. And that's the GDPR compliant version. Then you go a step further, Wi-Fi in shops, so Starbucks or Pret. If you go in there and you connect to the Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi isn't really free, it's analysing all of the data about the websites that you're on, the things you're doing. Mark Zuckerberg was found back in 2012 to have 1,200 pages of data on every single user. That's so small compared to what they have now. When they introduced this feature a little while ago, where you can respond with your emotion to a piece of content, that was after they were caught doing a psychological experiment in California where they were analysing the effect of different content in the news timeline to create an emotional response. They just put a button on there to legitimise it. They also did some analysis in Australia and were caught out as well. So analysing, psychoanalysing 13 to 18-year-olds to work out when they feel vulnerable, because apparently that's the best time to sell them something. So when you look at products like this, it's designed to give you a nice safe area to talk to your friends without risk of other people coming and intruding on it. But when you look at it, what goes on behind the scenes of technology like that, it's quite scary. They do biometric analysis of your face to work out where those emojis should go. But doing that tells them a huge amount about you, far beyond just where to put those emojis. It's the same stuff that was found in Russia to enable you to actually track pretty much any citizen across Russia on their equivalent of Facebook. Tinder, the dating app, was found to have 800 pages of data on every user. Google keep coming out and saying we accidentally recorded people with Google Home, which you can't really trust, given that a few years ago they accidentally hoovered up all of the Wi-Fi data with their Street View cars. And there's apps like this, which is a piece of software you can embed in any other app. So in any of the apps you have on your phone, this might be installed. And what happens is when you give the app you have installed permission to save a photo, so let's say you create a meme on your phone and you save it into your photo roll, when you give permission to that app to save the photo, this piece of software goes in and analyzes every single photo on your phone and uploads the data to advertisers, without you ever really knowing that it was going on. This is an experiment a friend of mine at a big US university was doing for a number of years. This is about 8 years ago now. And the idea is as you take corks out of the different vases on the surface, it plays different musical instruments. And it's doing that based on the distribution of weight on the surface. So it can work out which vase the cork has been taken out of. Now fast forward to the version he showed me last year. They've now created a surface, just like a table. When you put your laptop on it, just by resting your hands on the keys, he can tell you what keys you're about to press before you press them. And then as you start to type and you start to move your hands, he can tell you what keys you're going to press next before you press them, up to 3 or 4 keys in advance. So now you don't need to be worried about the data that gets collected through Wi-Fi in Starbucks. You have to think about the data that's being collected through the table you put your laptop on. And it gets even better. So there was an announcement at a hacking conference a few months back that showed a security engineer had worked out how to detect every single key you've ever pressed on your mobile phone just by analysing the battery usage on your device. Every single keystroke you've ever made, just from your battery. So when you think about that, you think, well, we're all in trouble, really. And the fact that nobody reads privacy policies and terms of use doesn't really matter, because the argument is, what would you do about it anyway? Even if you knew all of that was going on, what would you do? I've still got Uber on my phone, I still use Facebook, even though I know all of this is going on. And the reason I have that is because there's no better solution that solves the problems. But the reason you have to think about this stuff is for the same reason climate change is important. People don't understand the importance of small actions today on the consequence of tomorrow, because you just can't see how much of an effect they will have in aggregate. So for the next bit, you have to, and I've realised that, well, imagine Circle of Life is playing away in the background. I know there's a new film out, so I need to actually update this now, which is slightly upsetting. But you might have seen a little while ago, there was a headline where The Economist, this big, important, respected newspaper, said data is the new oil. Well, how can it be the new oil? Oil is a finite resource, and data, as you all know, is infinite. You're creating new data every day. So even from an economic point of view, you can't compare the two. But more importantly, you have to think about it in the use of the technology today. So let's take this as an example. Within the law in the UK, you as a person are named a data subject. So in the law, you are a data subject. A company like the Royal Mail would be a data controller. They're responsible for holding your data and choosing who can access it and for what purpose. And then someone like Domino's Pizza, who wants to send you advertising in the post, would be a data processor. And in the traditional world of advertising or technology, that's fine, because a controller can give some data to Domino's Pizza and then they delete it. But with artificial intelligence, that rule doesn't apply anymore. Because if the Royal Mail gives data to an AI, the AI trains its model, and even after the data's been deleted, the model still is smarter. And to give that a real example, and someone from the NHS in the room, so forgive me for a moment. A few years ago, the NHS gave a huge amount of data to Google. And it was done for the right reasons. It was done to help make medicine and healthcare better. But the thing you have to think about is, let's say the value of an artificial intelligence is roughly based on how intelligent it is. So Google might have been worth $50 million. And so the NHS give it this medical data, and it trains itself on this data, so now it might be worth $100 million. And they create the cure for cancer. And they sell that cure to a pharmaceutical company for $500 million. And that pharmaceutical company sell those drugs back to the NHS for $1 billion. Well, who pays for the NHS? You do. Your parents do. The people whose data was given to Google to help create the cure are also the people that now need to pay for access to the cure. So because data is being used to train AI, you're decoupling the source of the value from the end result. So it starts to create a rupture in the basic principles of how our economy is put together. And the argument a lot of companies would make, as did Google in this case, as do many, many other companies, is that the data that is shared is anonymous. Well, the problem is, AI never cared about your name anyway. If you're building an AI, it just needs a numeric identifier that will persist across all of the data that you're training the system with. It doesn't care that the name is Nick Oliverr. It doesn't care about my date of birth or my email address. It just cares that there's a number that is consistent across all of the other data. So this argument about anonymity starts to fall apart. And you need to ask really important questions with all of your other speakers, not to help put them on the spot. But a lot of the time, there's arguments that help AI fit within the law, but not within the principles of what is good for you as a person. So if you don't need a person's name, it's much like being blind. You can identify a person without seeing them. You have multiple senses, and those senses are equivalent to the different ways AI could also identify you. Who knows what this is? Anyone? No guesses? So this is something that Apple claims gives you privacy. It's called differential privacy. And the effective idea is that you can have different databases and they can create insights from those different databases without ever putting all of the data in the same place. So let's say you've got one database table that has my date of birth and another database table that has my name in it or something that identifies me through biometrics. Now, their argument is by not putting the data together, they protect my privacy. But with differential privacy, you could still create a script that tells it whether it's my birthday today or not, and to take an action based on that. Well, doesn't that kind of erode the entire point of it? Because if you still know it's my birthday, you don't need my date of birth, you don't need my name, you know that the entity in this room, me, has a birthday. So it kind of makes it pointless. The same is true with this. Anyone know what this one is? Homomorphic encryption. And so homomorphic encryption, where you look at things like Facebook, who say on WhatsApp, you've got end-to-end encryption. Well, now with fully homomorphic encryption, you're able to detect events within encrypted data without unencrypting it. So again, if you don't need to unencrypt the data to know that something has happened in there, doesn't that defeat the point of encryption? So a lot of the time, companies like Facebook will tell you they're becoming privacy-centric. They're just changing what the definition of privacy is. So that's why you need to think very philosophically about all of the different things that you do. So to give a really concrete example of how this works. So at the moment, consent the big thing GDPR and all of data privacy is designed to empower you through. The idea of consent is that by you not giving consent to sharing a specific piece of information, you effectively have a control over the positive or negative impact the use of that information could have on your life. So if you don't tell somebody who you are, that company can't do anything good or bad that would affect your life. And that's how this would work. But with AI, it could simply look at your face and know that information without you ever having to have shared it in the first place. Doesn't that undermine the entire premise of consent? If you don't need to tell a system about yourself in order for it to know something about you, what is the purpose of consent? So we've already, just in the last few moments, broken what the meaning of privacy is, broken the meaning of encryption, and broken the meaning of consent, all through the adoption of AI. So not only is consent dead, but it gets slightly scary. So this won't work without sound, but there's a film called Her. And the idea of Her is that Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with an artificial intelligence. His wife has died, and so he ends up falling in love with this AI. And the reason he falls in love with the AI is because the AI knows more about him than he knows about himself. It's able to predict what he wants, when he wants it, why he wants it. And through that, he feels comforted and therefore falls in love with it. So let's put that in the context of advertising. And bouncy castles are the way to do it. So I don't want a bouncy castle. I probably do, but let's assume for a moment that I don't want a bouncy castle. Now, if advertisers are doing the right job with an AI, they would be able to convince me that I want a bouncy castle. So advertisers start to make the decision for me about whether I want a bouncy castle or not. Let's go a step further. Dating apps. So with an app like Tinder, 800 pages of data doesn't just come from your name and your age, it comes from their analysis of all of the images that are in the app and how you swipe them. And so what you start to realize is that the order in which people's photos appear are being powered by machine learning based on your preferences and how you behave. So Tinder starts to choose who you love and hate by manufacturing the serendipity that results in which way you'll swipe. We already saw how AI could be used to micro-target and cause an effect on the political system and change the way that you might perceive a certain candidate. But in what's quite scary to think about is Google, just from how you search, can make a determination on whether you're sick or not, and then have the choice as to whether to help you or not, effectively choosing whether you live or die. Because all of this information is pre-known about you, more than you know about yourself. But going back to the philosophy side of things, this is where that arbitration of who is right and who is wrong comes into it. And take Kanye West, a very polarizing figure in the news these days. He's got very strong views in all sorts of different ways. Does that mean that he's right or that he's wrong? Should you be the ones to decide whether he's right or wrong? Should a company be the one to decide whether he's right or wrong? No. Let him be him. Unless he's hurting somebody, let him be him. And an example of that is like a fridge, and I know this is a silly example, but a fridge is only cold if it's hot outside. You can have a fridge in the desert, and so long as what's inside that fridge is colder than the air outside, it's still a fridge. It might be 20 degrees inside the fridge, but it's still colder than the outside. So when you think about decisions of what is right and what is wrong, at the moment, we're creating a society where, because AI is centralized to the big 4 or 5 tech companies on the west coast of America, they are the ones that now decide what is right and what is wrong. Their view of society is being imparted on the rest of the world. And when you look at this in an even scarier point of view, there's something called declarative theory, which effectively argues what is required in order to be a sovereign state. Now, Facebook has the #1 messaging platform in 200 countries around the world. Facebook has defined territory through being in those countries. It's got a population, you, users. It's got a government, Mark Zuckerberg, and a capacity to enter into relations with other states, the APIs. Facebook is a state. Facebook could be the new country. It's just a digital form of what is already argued as being a legitimate form of sovereign state. So when you think about that, you now realise Zuckerberg and Larry Page and all of the others out there are now becoming presidents of the world. They're building their own economy as well. So a few final thoughts. Take IBM Watson, going on this idea that consent is dead and that companies shouldn't be the ones to decide what is right and wrong. Take IBM Watson. So Watson trains itself on a lot of medical data, and in the US they're doing a lot of work in and around how Watson can help doctors cure patients. So let's say Watson's been trained to detect heart disease just by analysing the capillaries in your eyes, so the blood vessels in your eyes. So you could walk into a room and just by looking at your face, Watson could tell whether you have a heart disease or not. Now, should Watson tell you? Well, the first thing is the Hippocratic Oath says do no harm, not save the world. That's why so many pharmaceutical companies can make so much money. So it doesn't have to tell you, but let's assume for a moment Watson does have to tell you. When does Watson tell you? Does Watson tell you now, while you're at an event? Or does Watson tell you in 8 hours when you're home with your family? Well, Watson is the one that's in charge of that decision. Because at the moment, you don't know that Watson knows that. If you knew Watson knew that, you wouldn't need to tell Watson to tell you. It's a paradox. And that's where this traditional unidirectional consent is broken. Because in order to break the paradox, you have to have bidirectional consent, but you can't have bidirectional consent unless you resolve the paradox. And there's simple ways of thinking about that, whether a fridge should order food for you based on your diet and whether it's healthy for you. Should Samsung decide whether to order you a Mars bar or, I don't know, some kale chips? But just a few final examples. In shops, smart mirrors are starting to become really popular. So if you go into a shop and the neural network within that smart mirror that helps detect who you are in order to give you better service and change the menu, imagine if this has just been trained to detect 2 gender types, male and female. Now that's okay. But what happens if it's been trained to detect multiple gender types? And you walk into the shop and you're with someone in your family and you don't identify as male or female. Should that mirror interact with you in the wider societally accepted norm of male and female, or in the way that you self-identify? Well, if it interacts with you in the way that you self-identify and the person you're with doesn't know that that's how you self-identify, that's now broken your privacy. Because it's now shared a piece of information that you didn't want it to share. Again, the paradox of consent starts to create pretty significant issues across all of society. So my final thought, Elon Musk. You've always got to end on something from Elon Musk. The guy's crazy. So for years, everyone's been talking about creating connections into the brain. And now with Neuralink, they're plugging AI into the limbic system, the dumb part of the brain, which is amazing. Really, really cool. Like, this is an old slide. He's obviously got the robots that now start to wire it into your brain. When you think about all of the different things I've just spoken about, it started with creating an API for your data. Something that enables you to connect yourself into another system. To enable your data to help create a better service or product for you in the real world. But where we start to go now, in the area that I'm now working on, is effectively an AI for consent. Something that will actually be built around you. Think about it as a firewall for people. Something that, not just when you walk into a room, it helps connect certain data about you, but it actually helps protect you from manipulation, from companies trying to change the way you think, from data or intelligence being forced upon you to change your outlook on society. Something that is trained based on the way that you see society, but also inherits the values and the views of those around you. Because much like in real life, the way that you perceive the world is often derived from how your parents have taught you to see the world. So no one AI that's designed to protect your views can be trained just by you. It has to see the world around you. And so that, hopefully, will be the next part of the journey of People.io. Create an AI for people that informs bidirectional consent and hopefully resolves the paradox of consent and AI. So I'll leave you with the important polar bear. All of these things will have significant consequence in the future. Putting an empty Coca-Cola can in the recycling today seems like hassle, but we now know the criticality of the environment in the future unless we make small decisions today. You, as the future of development, technology, AI, consumer experiences, you have to think about the impact of what you create on the future of society. Your view, whether right or wrong to everyone else in this room, may not be right and wrong to everyone else in the rest of the world. You have to think in a way that is far broader than a simple view of technology is today. Because unless you think like that, we're going to end up in a pretty dark place in the future. And you are the future that's going to make it right. Thank you very much.
Well, Nick, this was mind-blowing for me. Was it mind-blowing for everyone else? Yes, it was pretty awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. So any questions for Nick? Lots of controversial thought, lots of incredible things he said that most people would not even share. If people go, I still available.
We've had to shut it down at the moment. It may make a comeback in the next few months. One of the problems we had, like I say, we launched in early 2017. We got all of these users. Everyone around us, all of our investors and companies said it wouldn't work. And we launched it, and it worked too well. We had over 120 million questions answered in the app. So we had so much data, so many users, and really passionate community. But yeah, unfortunately, we couldn't make it work. So failure was the success of the platform, unfortunately.
What is the main challenge at the moment? Is it development again, or something else?
The challenge with consent AI is the industry and government and everybody is looking at GDPR, which is something I'm sure you've heard about and we'll hear more and more about. Everyone's looking at that going, we've got the solution to data privacy. So 4.5 years ago when I started People.io, no one cared about personal data, no one cared about privacy, no one realized the significance of the problem. GDPR came along and everyone said, oh, obviously this is a big problem, this is a huge problem. But what started to happen is companies are just hiring lawyers to make their old technology legally compliant, not change the way they do things. Some companies are, but not many. So the problem we now have with consent AI is we're 4 years ahead again. So what we're trying to build with bidirectional consent is an entirely new way of thinking for companies. And a small example would be when you call up, I don't know, let's say you call up to book a train ticket, or you call your banker. When you call them, they're already analysing your voice to work out who they should connect you with based on predicted age, gender, any different number of facts. You never gave them consent for that. So all these things are happening, we know they're happening, but you as a consumer don't. So our problem now is trying to work out how you convince companies to be responsible when it's not the law that forces them to be responsible.
More questions?
Could you give an example of how consent AI would work? So like more something that you could maybe explain so I could understand it better.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to take that example with the call center. So you call the call center, it works out right. Male, happy. So it made that determination. We'll then choose who I'm connected with in the call center. So the idea of consent AI is that when they've made that set of observations, they would put that data observation in an escrow. So that escrow is kind of a safe holding place for the intelligence they've created about you. And so if you have a consent AI account, it will be connected to your account. If you don't, after the call, you'll be able to go and claim that data through creating a new consent AI account. But the idea is that then, for every future time that you call the bank, they will now check whether you give permission to share certain types of data. So you might say, like after you've had the call, you might have the consent AI app and say, actually in the future, I don't want them to use my emotional state to make a decision about me. They can use my gender or my age, whatever, but not my emotional state. And actually, 3 weeks later, you might realise that now you're getting really bad service. So you say, actually, you can use my emotional state again. So you have the ability to turn it on and off. But what we'll do in phase 1 is use your manual preferences to train the models that over time will enable us to handle that autonomously for you. So then, if you walk into a shop and you've got a smart mirror, just by knowing that it's you and connecting that to a Consent AI account, we will be able to represent what view or what interest you have and what consent you would be willing to share with that third party.
Fascinating. It sounds very complicated when it comes to, I don't know how you're going to work out in terms of connecting with all the companies and everyone who will use.
Yeah. It's, I mean, you might or may not be familiar, there's a company at the moment called Experian and Credit Score and many others. So they're the ones that choose whether you can get a credit card or not. But from a big company point of view, every time you open a new bank account or you don't pay a bill, the banks have to share certain information with Experian and those services. And the reason that banks are willing to do it is because that also helps them work out who they should give credit cards to. So what we're trying to do is create a similar model to that, where there is value to the businesses connecting that type of data, because they'll get more value out of the other side, but where people are put right in the heart of it. Exactly.
Any other questions? Yeah.
What's to stop the consent app collecting your data though when you connect it to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had so many challenges around how do we stop ourselves from becoming the bad people. Luckily, I'm really stubborn. So even though we could have done bad things, like my view is very strict. But I think our goal is with this data escrow to create something that could eventually just be open source. Because in the way that we want to build the platform, it would be like Visa or MasterCard or American Express. So you as a consumer don't have to use us. It will be interoperable, so you could use any other service and connect into it. But I think the long-term goal is that we can find a way to create an open ecosystem where we don't actually hold the data. And I was talking with a chief scientific officer from a business yesterday about an idea that they had for this. And their idea was to create a dataless version, where effectively you would have a model that sees the data in real time and is training itself, and it's just the model that is then kind of passed around. The model is kind of your avatar that's put into other scenarios. And that's a great example of where the technology makes sense, but that actually creates an even bigger risk, because even though it's not sharing your raw personal data with another person or company, all you need to do is fire 1 million requests at that model, and you'll reverse engineer all of the data straight back out of it. Because it would say, yes, this is true, no, that's not. You ask enough questions, which is easy to do with technology, and you've now got a mirror image from the model. So really, like, for me, the data and collecting the data is less of a concern as to how the data can be used and controlled in its use.
What if when the Consent AI app begins to function autonomously, what if that becomes a deterrent to people's services?
How do you mean?
Like, for example, like, let's say a person is calling 991 or something, and they're asking for personal data, and the Consent AI app chooses to autonomously decline.
Yeah, great question. So one of the areas that we're exploring a use case for is facial recognition with the police. So there's a lot of concern around police using facial recognition, because by the time you get stopped by the police, they've already made an assumption about your innocence or guilt. And if you question it, there's like not too much you can do to take them to court over the decision that they've made. It's a presumption before you've had an opportunity to fight it. So one thought we've had is actually in that scenario, if you call 999, would be that they can make a legal request for the data, but there's a record of that request in the escrow. And so you then have an ability to look back in time, and if it was unlawful, if it was done without due cause, or whatever the legal mechanism for analysing its validity would be, you can then take legal action against that entity. And if you think about that from if you think about the security services, the people that protect us all in the background of society, they need access to certain types of data. The problem at the moment is there's no record that you are aware of that shows who or what they have accessed. So the idea here is that actually it enables a greater level of access to data and to see your information, but because there's a record of it, there's a greater transparency. So in the scenario of the police, they may have a legal permission to access that data to protect the local area, and you then might say, well, they stopped me, so now I'm going to go to court and find out what they were looking at, what their reason was, and all of those other things, which at the moment you wouldn't be able to do.
Any other questions? And what if at some point the consent AI prevents NHS, for instance, from accessing the data that could save your life?
So I think the goal of what we're trying to create is something that, and this in itself is a very ethical question. If you don't want the NHS to have access to that data, there would be an indirect indication that it may not be something equivalent to do not resuscitate. And that's an accepted kind of form within healthcare. So decisions over one's own life is as much a question as to whether you should allow chocolate to be advertised to you. I mean, the thought in and around it may be the same. Obviously, you need to think about psychological implications and such. But I think in what we're trying to do, and I was in a long time back in a ethics meeting with the Cabinet Office around healthcare data. And there was this very kind of strong view from the medical industry that data about your heart rate has to be of a very, very high accuracy and from a very specific type of machine, and that data from a Fitbit shouldn't be allowed in the same data that you get from a heart monitor in a hospital. Yet the likes of an Apple Watch or a Fitbit has a far greater ability to determine whether you've got a heart disease in a day-to-day basis, simply because it's not just seeing your heart rate data, but a whole load of other data about you in combination. And it's that combination of data, both in and outside of a certain context, that help give those companies more information. So if you only go to your doctor once a year, they may miss the things that actually flag up a certain medical illness. So I think for the idea behind consent AI, it would hopefully do the opposite. It would be the case that the NHS could make would add data into your escrow or into your consent AI, and it might simply be the doctor saying, I need to know how fit this person really is, how many times a week they've gone running, or like the type of running that they're doing. Are they doing it on an incline or on the flat? Those types of data points aren't really available at the moment, but that in itself might save you doing a stress test on a treadmill. If you know someone's running up inclines every day, that's going to be a better indication than having to wait 6 weeks to send them in for a specific test. So I think the opportunity to make it benefit people in healthcare is strong. We've erred away from anything on the healthcare side at the moment because the regulation around the data types and the use and the need for it to be of a very high certainty is a problem too far for us at the moment. We're sticking to slightly easier use cases, although police isn't exactly an easy use case. But I think importantly, like another example of how this works in policy or in society. So if you look at what happened in the political campaigns in America, so the advertising was used to micro-target people to change the way that they thought about certain candidates or about society. So if you want to regulate that as an issue, you can just go to Facebook and Google and start to tell them, here's what you can and can't do. And because it's coming out of limited set of data centers or out of a limited set of companies, you can have an ability to see what's really going on. But I think where this really starts to become a significant opportunity is when you go past that. And when you think about edge computing, who here's seen Derren Brown? Anyone seen Derren Brown, the illusionist? So he's like this magician, illusionist. And what he does is he'll have a big stage show and he'll pick someone from the crowd before they get there. And between them leaving the house and getting to the show, he'll have like a big bus with the number 3 on it, and a giraffe on the side of the street, and a lion at the entrance to the event. And the reason he does that is because he knows in that order he can change the way that your brain works. So when you go on stage and he says, give me a random number or pick an animal or like draw a picture, he has already planted that idea in your head from that series of different events. Now, if you think about edge computing, all of those little IoT devices in your life, whether it's your Nest thermostat at home, whether it's your Fitbit, whether it's a smart mirror, all of those different devices. Now, if they've all been trained in a certain way, they in themselves might start to affect the way you think about things. So each device by itself may be absolutely fine, because it's only a tiny bit off what is normal. But if you, as an individual, start to interact with all those devices, they may have been set up to cause a manipulation of the way that you think. And the only way to detect that is from your point of view. You can't regulate against that because it's kind of this maze where it only has an effect in combination. So another kind of viewpoint for the consent AI from a security point of view is being able to detect how you as individuals are being manipulated by different news websites, by different devices, in virtual reality, in augmented reality. There's a really interesting challenge around how you can detect that.